All right. This is something network and security engineers should know. It's about nostalgia, legacy tech in the cloud era. So I believe STP, spanning tree protocol, and let's say link redundancy, such as port channel, LACP. Um, these are something that you will not even configure or will not even see in the cloud. What other once awesome tech is headed for the retirement home in the cloud era? And
you know, I
and there are advanced routing as well that is feeling old. Is MPLS on its way out? And what about storage switching?
okay, great. I hope I don't hurt any feelings talking about MPLS. I know some very big MPLS fans out there. So I'll start with the first question of like what technologies are going to the kind of graveyard as we're transitioning to cloud networking. A trend is layer 2 technologies, okay? Because layer 2 is really completely abstracted. So you said it, spanning tree protocol. Thank God, spanning tree protocol can go away in the cloud. Redundancy, layer 2 and layer 3 redundancy protocols. I'm thinking like HSRP is one that I worked with a lot. That those will be gone because you're not thinking about like redundant switches anymore.
No device redundancy, no link redundancy in the cloud.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. And any link redundancy you do in the cloud is actually controlled at layer 3. Generally speaking, it's going to be managed usually via BGP, actually almost always via BGP, and then over a direct connect or VPN, which if we're talking about technologies that are still super relevant in the cloud that you may be exposed to on premise, certainly BGP, IPsec, even VLANs, because I think if you understand VLANs, like that's the foundation you need to understand subnetting and VPCs, but also you have to trunk VLANs into a direct connect in order to create a private connection into your AWS network. So there's lots of great stuff. But honestly, I think a good way to think about it as like a demarcation point is if it's a layer 2 or like layer 2.5 protocol, it's probably less relevant in the cloud. And if it's layer 3 and above, it's very likely still relevant. Speaking of something I just said, layer 2.5 protocol, I will open. I'll open the can of worms that is MPLS. I've heard MPLS referred to as like a layer 2.5 protocol because, just under the hood, it's like it sits on top of BGP, but it does something called label switching, which is like kind of layer 2, but also kind of layer 3. Yes. You could get in a philosophical debate about that, but MPLS. What's happening with MPLS is there was a trend for a while where people were actually, which I thought was, by the way, I always thought this was madness, but people were deploying MPLS in the data center, not as service providers, but actually as a mechanism to like build really complex data center architectures. I think that I haven't seen that pattern as much. Where MPLS, as much lately, I should say, where MPLS I think will always be relevant is for service providers. So if you're a company that, for example, I mentioned a direct connect, right? That's a direct connection between a private entity and your cloud. Well, you're not usually configuring MPLS as a customer, but a lot of those direct connect networks almost certainly underneath whatever service provider is operating that. Sometimes it's Amazon, sometimes that service provider is a third-party service provider like a CenturyLink or some ISP. They are likely running MPLS underneath that. So the folks that know, I think MPLS will still be relevant to know if you're working in a service provider context. Otherwise, as much as you usually need to know about MPLS as a networker is just how to peer with your service provider, and they'll usually send you a config file and tell you what to do. So you don't have to learn that too much unless you really want to, because it is kind of cool tech at the end of the day. But I think MPLS less relevant for the day-to-day network engineer, but still super relevant for those working in a service provider capacity.
All right. But routing skills, BGP, OSPF, still relevant to the cloud. Yes?
100%. Yes. Especially BGP, because BGP has a really great ability to do this special thing called, and I'm blanking right now. ECMP, equal cost multipathing. And a lot of protocols can do equal cost multipathing, but the way BGP can do it between different sites makes it a very useful tool for building reliable and high bandwidth connections into your cloud environment. So I see BGP a lot in the cloud. I'll say I personally see OSPF, like ISIS, very much less in the cloud context, because think of in the cloud, BGP is oftentimes how you will like connect into the cloud, or connect clouds to each other, or connect the data center into a cloud. But once you get into the cloud itself, unless you're doing something funky, almost everything is controlled with, believe it or not, something that looks a lot like static routes, which is oftentimes a trip for network engineers that are used to everything being protocol centric. In the cloud context, it's just different in that the way you configure everything looks like a static route. But that said, I think understanding routing, I still oftentimes will have to troubleshoot routing issues where there's a route going in one direction, but there's no return route, so the traffic can get back. So if you understand layer 3, whether it's protocols or just how to trace route and suss out reachability in a network like that, that's still super important in a cloud context, because there's still a lot of routing happening, and frankly, sometimes even more complex routing than in the data center, because you'll send data around to all these different networks and services in the cloud to maybe provide security. For example, you might have like some special configuration where you're boomeranging traffic into a security VPC and then back into some other VPC. So if you're learning routing, keep learning it. If you know routing, that's amazing. We need you still.
Okay, but MPLS, other layer 2 protocols, you can skip it.
Unless you want to work at a service provider, I would brush through the layer 2 stuff for right now. Yeah.
Okay. How about security? Those configuration, CVE, for example. What else?
Yeah.
Findings or security skills analysis. These are something that you don't need to unlearn it. As a matter of fact, you have to improve or develop skills, especially moving to the cloud.
Totally, absolutely. This from a security perspective, whether it's stateful firewalls or even just vulnerability awareness like CVEs, OWASP. If you've ever messed with a WAF, or web application firewall, there's this thing called OWASP that we use for rule sets. App ID, like layer 7 deep packet inspection with IDS and IPSs. All of this is still directly relevant in the cloud. If you're, one thing I would suggest, if you're curious to just get a peek of kind of what the idea of like cloud security looks like, if you're used to like on-premise or data center security, there's a company that I'm just personally a big fan of right now. They're called Wiz, and they're kind of a new product, but that launched, I think, in 2020. But the way they do cloud security, it's very CVE focused. But if you want to see like what security looks like in a cloud native context when it comes to finding vulnerabilities and remediating issues, if you're curious to see, like, obviously firewalls are still relevant, but there's other attack surfaces that are now open in the cloud. Check out like a demo of Wiz, because they have a really good way of explaining it, and also can if you're somebody who's configuring firewalls or IDSs and IPSs today, could maybe help you branch out a little bit more, so that way you can bring your current like network security skill set into your cloud environments, but also start to grow as a security professional and learn more about cloud native security things.